Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted, and we're going to finish the second half of our lecture on manifest destiny in war. Now, as always, take a moment, make sure you hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline, the rest of it, and pay attention to the rest of those key terms at the left. Got it? Let's get started. All right, so we left off with the end of the Mexican-American War. And we mentioned at the very end the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was designed to talk and deal with what to do with the inhabitants, these somewhere between 86 and 116,000 Mexicans who were living in that territory. And I gave you the very kind of Cliff Note version of or oversimplified version of what happened to them, which was if they wanted to, they could just stay in their land. And as of January 1st, 1849, they would become U.S. citizens. And again, this is all very theoretical and good. But what exactly does this mean in practice? In order to understand what this actually means, we need to back up a little bit. And we need to kind of delve into the history of U.S. immigration policy. Now, the good news for us as of 1848, 1849, there's not a lot of history there. So this won't take very long, but bear with me as we go through some of the history of United States immigration policy. And so we start with our very first immigration law, which was in 1790. And again, remember, the nation was, we had the American Revolution, ends in 1781, or 1783, sorry. And of course, we have our new government, the new constitution that starts in 1789. And so in 1790, we passed our very first immigration law, just very aptly titled 1790 Immigration Law. And in this, Congress first defined eligibility for citizenship. So in other words, if you want to become a citizen, these are the requirements. This is what makes you eligible or not eligible for citizenship. But most importantly, you see on the screen highlighted that any alien being a, quote, free white person, unquote. And this is important because citizenship in the United States, based on our very first Immigration Act, said that if you want to be eligible for citizenship, you must, number one, be a free white person. Now, this was all in theory. Now, in practice, they also would things that you obviously only white, but also you had to be male because women were not eligible for citizenship at that point. So you must be male. You most often needed to be a property owner. So if you're a woman, you're non-white, you're indentured servant, you're enslaved, you're African American, you cannot be a citizen. The only other basic requirement outlined in this law was you had to take a loyalty oath and you had to be a resident of the country for 2 years. And so the basic requirement was very simple. You must be an eligible person, as in you must not commit any crimes. You must swear an oath of loyalty. Again, that's basic. But the two big things were you must be white, you must have 2-year residency. And the thing is, though, this 1790 immigration law doesn't change for the next 80 years. In other words, the basic requirements of you must be in good standing, or good moral character was the term they used. You must swear oath of allegiance. Okay, those still exist today, by the way. But the basic two requirements of a residency time period and white free white male, those become the basis of our immigration law for the next 80 years. In fact, that you must be a free white person or free white male doesn't change at all until after the Civil War. So for 80 years of our history. The only thing that does change is the length of residency requirement. It was increased from 2 to 5 years. And then in 1798, John Adams passed the very famous or infamous Alien and Sedition Acts, which increased it to 14 years. And then Thomas Jefferson would pull it back to 5 years in 1802. But while the residency requirement does change throughout the years, and they would later drop the land owning requirement, the one thing that remained the same from 1790 to post-Civil War is that you must be a free white person. But that begs the question, how do you define a white person? What is white? What is whiteness? Who is white? Are Mexicans white? Are French people white? Are there shades of white? And I love this meme's going around the last couple of years, obviously. Anytime anything bad happens, we kind of use this. Hey, you can own a gun as long as you're white, of course. You have no problem with that. You're not deemed a threat, right? These are all things we've been going through the last couple of years in the United States. But I want to give you some how this plays out in real life, though. So Thomas Jefferson, I mentioned him a minute ago. He becomes president in 1800. He reduces the residency requirement from 14 back to 5 years. And traditionally speaking, in Jefferson's day, white meant what we call a WASP, W-A-S-P. It's an acronym that stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. In other words, a true, quote-unquote, good American, U.S. citizen, is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, a WASP. In other words, you need to be old stock from the Anglo-Saxon areas of Europe. So Northern Europe, Western Europe. But that definition, that traditional definition of white, is almost immediately challenged. Because if you recall correctly, in 1803, Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Purchase, right? Doubles the size of the United States. But in addition to the Native Americans who lived there, there were more than 50,000 white people, quote unquote white, along with 3,200 free people of color, mostly of African descent. And I say free people of color because these are people who enjoyed equal rights of free people in French society. And the question remained immediately is, what do you do with all these people? And this became a problem for the US government immediately. Because you have more than 50,000 whites plus 3,200 people of color, plus you have the Indians. Again, we're going to ignore Indians for a minute because we're just going to push them off and kill them. But and again, for the free people of color, we're going to eventually push them off or enslave them. But I want to focus on those 51,000 some French white people. Are French people white? Are they eligible for citizenship? Now, the treaty that gave us the Louisiana Purchase, that actually ceded the land to the United States, said, and I quote, "The inhabitants of the ceded territory shall be incorporated into the Union of the United States and admitted as soon as possible according to the principles of the federal government to enjoyment of all the rights, advantages, and immunities of citizens of the United States." So what does this mean? Does this mean that French people are good citizens now? They are not WASP. They are not Protestants. The majority were Catholics. And I can tell you this was not an easy sell. This was a big deal. The quote on the screen you see right now is a quote from the provisional governor of Louisiana. So in 1804, after the Louisiana Purchase is done, the United States divided Louisiana Purchase in different parts. The southern part became what is now Louisiana. There are about 34,000 free whites living in that region under the jurisdiction of Governor Claiborne. And Claiborne very explicitly says these French people are not good U.S. citizens, saying, quote, "The principles of our government are utterly beyond their comprehension. The representative system is an enigma that at present bewilders them. Not 1 in 50 of the old inhabitants appear to me to understand the English language." Now, let me stop for a minute there. Number one, they don't understand representative government. You do realize at 1803, 1804, when he says this, we are barely 20 years into our experiment of democracy. In fact, remember, if you remember U.S. history, our first government, the Articles of Confederation, failed. And we had to start over in 1789 with the Constitution. So we are literally only 15 years here. But yet, he says that bewilders them. In addition, he says that they don't appear to understand English. Well, in case you guys didn't realize, there is no official language in the United States. English is not the official language. It's just the common language spoken. But again, let me go on. Trials by jury will only embarrass the administration of justice. I do fear a representative government in Louisiana would be a dangerous experiment, as opposed to what the United States was doing for the past 15 years with a representative government, with no history of representative government because they came out of monarchy, much like the French were. So then why then are these so-called white people? Because if I were to ask students, I do this every year in my classes, are French people white? And the answer is, of course they are. But yet you see here the governor, the provisional governor of Louisiana, Claiborne, is basically saying they're not eligible for citizenship. And of course, if you go on and read through the documents that I've read through, you'll see that number one, the language issue. They speak French. It's a foreign language, even though we don't have an official language in the United States. There's a fear that they still favor the French form of government. Okay. Weren't 2/5 of the colonists prior to the American Revolution in favor of staying with the monarchy? They were Catholics. Again, there's great long animosity between Protestants and Catholics. And to be fair, there's also a big issue here because this is still the part of the French Revolution era in France. And there's been a lot of conflict over in France that Americans were fearful that would boil over into the United States if you admit French people. It would take 8 years, almost 8 full years until 1812, when the French would finally be welcomed as citizens, that they will be accepted as white, members of the race of European ancestry. And for the most part, French people will largely be respected and treated as equals. Now, the free people of color, no, but the quote-unquote white French were. So we do see an expansion of definition here of what white meant here. It was no longer just a WASP. Now we have Catholics, which is important when we get back to the story of the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ends it. So are Mexicans white? Because the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo has a lot to say about citizenship. Again, we're dealing with somewhere around 100,000 Mexicans who are living in the now U.S. territories. And in the treaty, Mexico tries its best to protect their people. And they will successfully get 2 articles of the treaty that are designed specifically to protect Mexican nationals, or the now former Mexican nationals. So of that, somewhere between 86 and 116,000, about 3,000 will self-deport. But that means still about 100,000 former Mexican nationals stay in the territory that was theirs, their homes, their property. They don't go further down south into Mexico. They stay in what is now the United States. And so 2 of these articles were directly aimed at them. Now, those 3,000 that left, they're under Mexican rule now, no big deal. But for the approximate 100,000 who remain, Article 8 protects their property from illegal confiscation. Now, this should be a no-brainer because, again, Thomas Jefferson, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? When you start reading, what the Southerners wanted regarding, protection of enslaved African Americans, they wanted protection of property. Most Americans agreed that one of the primary functions of the U.S. government was to protect private property. And so it should come as no surprise then if you were granting citizenship to these 100,000 Mexican nationals, you should have something that guarantees protection of property. This makes sense. Also, Article 9, that grants them citizenship with all privileges associated with it. So, right to property, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. All these things that are voting rights. These are all things that are granted via the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And again, this is all negotiated. This is done in a negotiation with Mexico and the United States to guarantee the rights of the people. So in theory, this means that the United States once again accepts another large group of people granting citizenship in mass. Looks like we did the 34,000 Louisiana French people. Now it's 100,000 Mexicans. But this also means that based on the 1790 immigration law that said white only eligibility for citizenship, this means then that Mexicans are white. Legally speaking, all Mexicans are white. There was no phenotype check. They didn't go door to door and see what color your skin was to say, are you white or not? The treaty was very blanket. If you were of Mexican descent, living in the Southwest, you were given citizenship, which means you are white. So much like their French counterparts, who were Catholic. So the Mexican people are given citizenship. They are deemed white, just like the French were. Much like the French, they're also Catholics. They spoke a different language, not English. They spoke Spanish. And unlike the French, the Mexicans did have a short tradition with representative democracy. That last point I just made, that they had a short history of democracy, should theoretically have made Mexicans better citizens than the French. But this is all theoretical. In practice, it would not be so welcoming. You see, there were some very important distinctions between the French and the Mexicans. First, the French were considered European whites, whereas Mexicans were at least or at best a mix of European and Indian. Remember, most of them, the stereotypical mindset of Mexican was they were mestizos. They were a mix of European white Spaniards, and Indians. Whereas the French were European white, Mexicans were theoretically at best mestizos. Not really full white, only half white. At worst, many viewed them as being Indian, as in their Indio traits outweighed their Spanish traits. So at best, they're considered mixed. At worst, they're considered Indian. And we all know from U.S. history how poorly the Native Americans were treated. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, as immigration historian May Nye argued, yes, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo bequeathed citizenship upon Mexicans, declaring them to be white by law. But they were a different white because they were a group of people who retained as she put it, a status as a conquered people. In other words, these were people who were defeated in war. The French had been allies during the American Revolution. So the Spanish, technically. But the Mexicans had not. They were just recently, the past year, defeated in a war. This makes them a conquered people, maybe seem lesser than the French. And it was these two big legacies, that of being a mixed race people, again, mixed at best, Indian at worst, and status as a conquered people, alongside ideas of manifest destiny and greed, that would see an almost immediate erosion of those so-called rights as citizens. Or, as historian Maynai put it, quote, Mexicans were thus deemed to be white for purposes of naturalization. But, she said, that was an unintended consequence of conquest. So she said, Mexicans were deemed white. In other words, they were said, you're white, you are eligible for citizenship based on the 1790 immigration law. But as she said, it was actually an unintended consequence of the war. In other words, the U.S. people at that 1848, 1849 really didn't care about 100,000 Mexicans. What they cared about was the 530,000 square miles of land. And the result of this, that they were considered a mixed race at best, Indian at worst, conquered people. The result was that Mexicans, despite having legal white status as citizens, they would inhabit a second-class stratum. Let me give you an example of this right off the bat. In the original Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, Mexico had included Article 10. You see on the screen. It stated that the U.S. government would honor and guarantee all land grants awarded in lands ceded to the United States to the citizens of Spain and Mexico by those respective governments. In other words, there was an extra clause or article put in by the Mexican government to firmly guarantee all land grants, which theoretically should have been part of citizenship status. But after agreeing to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States removed that Article 10, knowing that they would never honor these land holdings by the Mexicans. Mexico knew the land holdings of Mexicans living in the newly conquered territory was in peril. But the U.S. removed it, and the fears were founded. Because what's going to bear out, we'll see in the coming lectures, land is going to be stolen by the thousands of acres. Now, initially, in the immediate aftermath of the war, none of this really mattered, right? It was just a title on a piece of paper. But once the war is over, and by the time 1849 comes around and these former Mexican nationals now become U.S. citizens, these 100,000. Things are going to change quickly after the war ends. And the sad part is really, the fate of the Mexican nationals, the 100,000, was not really the top priority of the U.S. government. Because the big thing for them, for the U.S. government, that is, the U.S. people, was the 530,000 square miles of land they got. What do you do with all this land? And specifically, the larger, more pressing issue was the issue of slavery. Would this new land become a slave territory or a free territory? Now, theoretically, what was supposed to happen based on the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was anything below the 3630 line, the green line on your screen, was supposed to be a slave territory. Anything north of that would be free, which theoretically opens a bunch of that new territory up to slavery. But Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas argued for what he called popular sovereignty. Now, this is a very seemingly democratic prospect. The idea was you let the territories decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This was an appeal to the American democratic belief in local self-government. This idea that let the people who live there decide whether or not they want slavery or not. It sounds great, sounds good in theory, even though it ignores our historical precedent of compromises, the Missouri Compromise chief among them. However, the following year in 1849, it all goes to pot. Because California, let me go back to my map, California, which theoretically should be split in half here in two separate states, wants to enter as a free state. Now, doing so would end the Senate balance between slave and free states, angering Southerners. Now, to settle this issue, Stephen Douglas guides through Congress a number of small bills that collectively we call the Compromise of 1850. Now, if you're taking a normal U.S. history course, there's a lot of important things to digest here, but I want to focus on the few that are really pertinent to our discussion right now. Number one was that California would enter as a free state, and this would end Senate balance. Yes, this ticks off Southerners, but the second part of this was the territorial government of Utah and New Mexico would be open to popular sovereignty, which means the people themselves can decide, which means for the Southerners, they get a win here because they can take that territory, they could subdivide it into multiple states. And each smaller state would get to decide its fate regarding slavery based on popular sovereignty. Now, this is a huge issue in the stepstone process to the American Civil War. But I want to focus on one more thing, though, that's not usually talked about in U.S. history courses. The Compromise of 1850 set up huge problems for the newly minted Mexican Americans. So picture this now, it's 1850. They've had their citizenship for just over a year. Thousands upon thousands of whites, of U.S. Anglos, begin to flood and rush into these newly acquired territories at rapid rates. Of course, California makes sense, right? The discovery of gold in 1849. More on this next lecture. That makes sense to go to California, as hundreds and thousands of U.S. Anglos begin flooding to California to find gold, get rich quick. But the opening of the territories to popular sovereignty also spurred droves of whites to flood into the territories, especially what is now New Mexico and Arizona. The result is in all three of these territories, in California, New Mexico, and modern-day Arizona, there are going to be increased clashes between the newly incoming Anglos and the existing formerly Mexican residents, landowners. Because if the fate of slavery in these territories is going to be rested upon popular sovereignty, a lot of Southerners and Northerners realize you've got to get people there to vote. And so they begin sending and migrating tens of thousands of people into these areas. And of course, there will be clashes between the Anglos, the Mexicanos, and Native Americans. Of course, as whites came into the territory, they don't recognize the historic power in leadership that existed for generations in this what used to be northern fringes of Mexico. The Anglos wanted to Americanize the land in the name of manifest destiny. They wanted to take charge of the political systems. They dislocated the landed elite, which was stealing and ignoring the promises of land grants as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo. They displaced native merchants. They took charge and dominion over agriculture and farming. They also disenfranchised the masses. So even though theoretically these citizens should have had voting rights, they began to pass laws that made it so they couldn't vote. And these are all very general things that took place. And we're going to spend a lot more time on the specifics of this disenfranchisement, on the specifics of this clash between cultures and ethno-racial groups. the process and give you very specific examples in our next lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.